Press.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to tonight's workshop on preservation basics. Everybody's joining the room. It'll just take a couple minutes to get everybody in and logged in for today's event. So we'll just be a little bit patient here while we're waiting for everybody to join us, but thank you so much. We'll give it another minute or so to make sure everyone has time to join us before we get going. All right, I think with that, we're going to get started. As you heard when you came into the room, we are recording tonight's program. So those who weren't able to join us tonight will be able to catch that recording at a later date. Again, I'm Christiana Limniadis. I am Program and Outreach Manager for Preservation Maryland. Again, thank you for joining us tonight for Preservation Basics. As I just mentioned, this is going to be recorded, so you'll be able to watch it again at a later date. I would love to answer any and all questions that you have about the information presented tonight or anything preservation related. So please make sure to share those questions with us. We are in the webinar format for tonight, so you won't be able to necessarily unmute yourself and ask a question. But if you have a question that you'd like me to answer live tonight, please make sure to enter those into the Q&A section of Zoom. There is the chat box. You're more than welcome to write messages to each other or make comments on different things that we talk about tonight. But definitely just to make sure that I get your question answered, to put it in that Q&A. Tonight's program is the first of a series of 3 that we are co-hosting with the Talbot Historical Society. So thank you so very much to our partners in this program tonight, Talbot Historical Society. Again, we are Preservation Basics tonight, and then next month in February, we are going to be doing another virtual lecture on the landmarking basics. So we'll go a little bit deeper into what are the different types of designations that you can put on historic resources, and what are the necessary steps in that process to get those designated. And then in March, we will have an in-person workshop at the Talbot Historical Society where we will be talking about researching your historic properties. So please make sure to go check out more information about those workshops and to sign up on our website, just like you did for today's. And we also do have some representatives from Talbot Historical Society. Kayla and Peggy are here with us tonight. Thank you so very much. So if you do have questions for them, I'm sure we can certainly have them help us with some answers at the end as well. All right, so we are Preservation Maryland. We are your statewide historic preservation advocacy organization. We are here and working towards harnessing the power of historic places by revitalizing and reinvesting in communities, advocating and building the historic trades workforce for the benefit of all Marylanders. So again, we are your statewide historic preservation advocacy organization. We are here to help you with anything preservation related. While our state is tiny, it is mighty, and we can't be everywhere, right? We can't be at every hearing or commission meeting. We can't be standing in front of every building advocating for its reuse. So making sure that we provide you access to the tools and knowledge that you need to be in charge of your preservation destiny is vitally important to us. So tonight's workshop, Preservation Basics, we're going to kind of divide the topics into 3 general categories: terms and processes, designations and regulations, and then benefits. As I mentioned very briefly in the beginning, this is preservation basics. This is a lot of information that we're going to talk about, but kind of a crash course on the things that you as a regular property owner, regular community member will encounter in your daily life or as part of certain types of projects. So it's to help kind of just get you a better understanding of what these things mean and how they work in the world, and get you on a better path to being in charge, again, of your own preservation destiny. We're going to again save all the questions till the end during a big Q&A section. So any questions that you have, just put them into that Q&A section as soon as they pop into your brain. No need to wait till the end of the program. All right, so what is historic preservation? There's lots of definitions out there. Each expert has their own kind of crafted. The National Park Service has a bunch of really great definitions on their website as well. But ultimately, historic preservation is when a community comes together and identifies the resources that define them as a community, that they value, that are emblematic of their history, their culture, their significance, and then they together take steps to preserve and retain those resources into the future. Essentially what's happening. So that can happen at a local level, a community level with your town, your city, your county, or at that state and federal level as well. Something also to keep in mind about historic preservation is that it is the most sustainable way for us to deal with our historic built environment. We talk a lot about the culture aspect of it and the preservation of our history, but it is also the most economically feasible way to deal with our buildings and environmentally sustainable way to deal with our buildings. We'll talk a little bit about that at the end when we talk more about the benefits of historic preservation. Preservation, a national pastime, something that I like to include in all the workshops that I put on, is kind of placing historic preservation within the greater national narrative, right? We have been doing something under the title of historic preservation or a variety of different names over the years, basically since the beginning of this nation. A lot of naysayers or people who might not necessarily have a better understanding of what preservation is, kind of feel sometimes that it's something that pops up out of nowhere, that we've suddenly just started evaluating and prioritizing and trying to preserve our historic resources. But again, that's just not true. We've been doing it since the beginning of this here. And you can see this very abbreviated kind of greatest hits in the preservation timeline. We start all the way back in 1816 with the saving of Independence Hall in Philadelphia. The person who owned the building, it was privately owned, decided that he didn't want it anymore and he was going to tear it down. And the city kind of came together and was like, I don't know, we just did something not too long ago that was kind of cool in that building. We might want to keep it around for a little bit longer. And that was able to happen. And then eventually it was acquired by the city and then the federal government, and is one of our most visited National Historic Landmarks today. So again, lots of things happen at the federal, state, and local levels over the times, again, under whether it's a title of historic preservation, under conservation, variety of terms. Little old us, Preservation Maryland, your statewide group was formed in 1931, making us one of the oldest statewide organizations in the country. And then that brings us to 1966 with the National Historic Preservation Act. Here is a little film strip, or the negative strip of, or not, I guess it's a film strip, of LBJ signing the National Historic Preservation Act, which stated in its legislation that it is necessary and appropriate for the federal government, to accelerate its historic preservation programs and activities, to give maximum encouragement to agencies and individuals undertaking preservation. So again, with this National Preservation Act, it says that at a national level, preservation is important. And we as a government should be taking the steps necessary to support preservation efforts in all of that we do on a federal level, and how that impacts the rest of our work as a nation. There are several different things that are created by that initial act in 1966, and it has been reauthorized, it has been expanded, it's been renewed many times since then. So this wasn't just a one-time law in 1966 and we haven't touched it again. We've come back many times to expand and strengthen this National Historic Preservation Act. But of all of the things that have been created under this act, I want to talk about these three first, and that's the National Register of Historic Places, the National Historic Landmark Program, and then the state and tribal historic preservation offices. And, as I mentioned in the slide before, this law sets forth this federal, priority for an importance on preservation and undertaking preservation steps. But it establishes that preservation, that federal framework for how to do that. So it's not just, hey, we want to think about preservation. These are the programs and policies that we're going to institute to actually make that happen. So these three, the reason we're going to talk about these three are three ones that come into the normal average Joe's life a little bit more often than some of the other ones, and a little bit more prominent. Excuse me, in our general community. But there is a lot of programs made from this. And again, every way that we today interact with historic preservation, whether it's on the local level or the federal level, has been shaped, and that general framework has been created by this law. So the first thing we'll talk about is the National Register of Historic Places. You can call it by its full name, National Register of Historic Places. You can call it just simply the National Register. You can call it the NR, the NRHP. Any version of those are perfectly fine. National Register, not registry, though. Let's keep that in mind. As you see on the screen, it is the federal government's official listing of resources deemed worthy of preservation for their historic significance. While we talk mostly about buildings when we work in preservation, because that just makes up the vast majority of our built environment, technically, when we're talking about historic preservation and the things that are eligible for listing in the National Register, we're talking about resources. So a resource could be an individual building, it could be a structure like a bridge, it could be an object like a monument or a statue, a site, whether natural or man-made, and then historic districts, which are then contained with multiple resources, are also resources. So when we talk about the National Register, it's really important to understand that it's not just a listing of places that are historic. There has been European colonization on this land for over 400 years. There's lots of places that we would identify as being historic and having historic significance. But it's not simply that something historic happened there or associated with that space. It's that resource is worthy of preservation for its historic significance, that there is something that's worthy to preserve associated with that significance. That's relating and talking about integrity. Now, whatever that historic significance is, that resource has integrity to that significance. So if you're saying that this building is very, very important because George Washington slept here, then to be able to be eligible for the National Register, there's lots of eligibility requirements, but that initial kind of check mark is it needs to be worthy of preservation for that significance. Does it have integrity to that time when George Washington slept there? If that room that he slept in has been completely remodeled and nothing survives, none of the original finishings or any of the original architecture of that space in that building survives from when that important event happened, that doesn't diminish the importance of that event, but there's nothing left to preserve of that significance. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's worthy of preservation or worthy for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. We're going to talk more about the National Register in a couple of slides. So that was an abbreviated story on there. The other program I want to talk to that's established by the National Historic Preservation Act is the National Historic Landmarks Program. Now, technically, this program did exist prior to 1966. Technically, with the signing of the Historic Sites Act in 1935 kind of creates this program, but with the signing of the 1966 Act, it kind of formalizes this program in a way that we see it today into the National Historic Landmark Program, NHL, capital NHL. And incorporates the process into the nomination process, or aligns the nomination process with that of the National Register nomination process. For the National Register of Historic Places, you can have significance that's relates just to the local community, to state level, or federal level. Whereas the National Historic Landmark Program is really reserved for the creme de la creme of national significance. It is those places, those resources that hold exceptional national significance. These are places that if they did not exist, if the events or individuals associated with those resources had not existed, were not there, whatever the situation is, that our national narrative would be a different story without these types of resources. So these, again, are super important resources. There are hundreds of thousands of resources on the National Register of Historic Places. But when we look at the National Historic Landmark Program, the NHL program, we only have around like 2,500, 2,600. So again, it's kind of reserved for those most important. In Talbot County, because again, we're kind of focusing on Talbot, there are 5 resources listed as National Historic Landmarks. When we look at the whole state, there's only around 76 in the state of Maryland. So you guys have a nice number in Talbot. One of them is a standing structure, and you can see that picture in the top right over there. That is the Y House, Y House and Plantation. It was built 1781 to 1784 by the great-great-grandson of the original settler and operator of that plantation, the Lloyd family. It's not only the home of the generations of Lloyd family, but also generations of enslaved Americans. It was a functioning plantation. Most notably, Frederick Douglass had been enslaved at this site for a while. But in recent times, there's been incredible work to uncover the information about those enslaved individuals. And it's incredible stuff through the Archaeology in Annapolis project through University of Maryland. So definitely recommend looking that up. The other 4 resources that are listed as National Historic Landmarks in Talbot County are all actually skipjacks, because again, it's resources. We don't just protect and preserve significance associated with buildings. We also have all types of resources. Boats are resources. The skipjack on the top left hand is the Hilda Wiling. I'm not sure how you exactly say that. It was built in 1905, and it's noted as an excellent example of a small skipjack. It's actually considered one of the greatest and fastest skipjacks of that size of skipjack. It was listed in the National Register in 1985 and then designated an NHL in 1995. And then on the bottom there, you see Edna Lockwood, which has the caption from the newspaper image that you have there is the last example of an oystering vessel called a buggy. I don't know, I'm probably saying that horribly wrong, but another example of a skipjack. This one was listed in the National Register in 1986 and then designated an NHL in 1994. All right, and then the last thing from the National Historic Preservation Act that I want to talk to you about is the creation of state and tribal historic preservation offices. So, as I mentioned, the National Preservation Act is saying we need to do this preservation stuff, but at a federal level, that's a lot of work to happen, right? And that's a lot of interaction with the general public to make all those things happen. The federal government understands that they cannot be the point person that makes all of these things happen. So to make sure that we can successfully do preservation the way that we need to do preservation, following preservation standards, and to create those preservation standards, we need to have a fuller framework, right? And so that's when the federal government requires that every state create a preservation officer, preservation office, so that they are then that kind of middleman, that point person for the general public, and that point person for helping to operate the federal preservation policy and program. It says state/tribal because in subsequent expansions of the National Preservation Act, this section of the bill, of the legislation, was expanded to not only require every state in the union, but to also require all federally acknowledged Native American tribes also then would need to have a preservation officer. So there is an official contact for preservation issues. Here in Maryland, our SHPO, our State Historic Preservation Office, SHPO, is known as the Maryland Historical Trust. It actually predates 1966 Preservation Act. We were one of the few states that had created preservation statewide nonprofits or governmental agencies before the 1966 Act. So ours is still kind of a quasi-public and private entity, but it's found in the federal and the state government within the Department of Planning. And then there's several different offices within the National Maryland Historical Trust that help execute the different things. So there's the Office of Planning, Education, and Outreach, does education and outreach. Research and Survey and Registration Office, focus on the National Register nominations, on that survey work, those types of things. And then the Office of Preservation Services, working on more technical projects and grants and stuff of that nature. The best thing about our SHPO here in Maryland, about MHT, the Maryland Historical Trust, is their website called Medusa. I've worked in 4 states now doing historic preservation, and I have to say that the Medusa is the best state database for historic resources. If you literally just Google Medusa, Maryland, maybe put preservation in there, it'll be the first thing that pops up. It is basically a souped up Google map, right? You put your address in the search bar of the property that you're looking up, and it'll take you to that location, and you'll be able to access any documentation that might be on file with the state relating to that spot. So you can see the zoomed out view of the state. All of those purple markers are all National Register nomination listings. But there's lots of different layers, and there's tons of stuff to play with here and to play around. I highly recommend just goofing off on your personal time, checking out the documentation and buildings that you can look at in Medusa. When we talk about state and tribal historic preservation offices, another important thing to keep in mind is this kind of how preservation works, right? So the different spheres of preservation. We have a public sphere and we have a private sphere. So the public sphere is going to be those governmental agencies or commissions that regulate historic preservation. And on the private side, you're going to have those nonprofit or for-profit entities that can also then help you accomplish those preservation projects. So at the public side, at the federal level, that's the National Park Service. State level, Maryland Historical Trust, like we've been talking about. And then if you live in a community that has a local preservation ordinance, that local preservation commission is going to be that local regulatory agency. On the private side, the national level, we have the National Trust for Historic Preservation, National Preservation Organization, nonprofit. Statewide, Preservation Maryland, we're your group. And then there are some counties and small municipalities that have their own local preservation advocacy organization. We work hand in hand with so many of those groups in the state. Definitely love to see more of them, but they would also be able to assist you. Keeping in mind on that private side, on that nonprofit organization side, there are also lots of like affinity preservation groups out there. There's an organization called Docomomo that focuses just on the documentation and preservation of modern architecture. There are barn coalitions. There are organizations that just work on the preservation of train stations. So there's lots of niche groups that are out there that can also help you depending on your preservation adventure. Shifting gears to a slightly different topic is the Secretary of the Interior Standards and Guidelines. So in establishing in 1966 the federal kind of framework and position on valuing preservation, all of these programs need to be created. And if we're going to advocate for the preservation and the reuse of our historic buildings, then certainly we need to provide some recommendations, some standards and guidelines so that we can say, well, when we say preserve a building, this is what we're talking about, right? So that is exactly what the Secretary of the Interior, what the National Park Service has done. They have identified 4 different treatments for the preservation of buildings, right? How to treat historic buildings. And for each of those sets of treatments, they've created standards and guidelines. So standards are going to be that set of principles of what it means to undertake that particular treatment. And then the guideline is going to offer general design or technical advice of how to apply those standards onto the building. So there's sets of standards and guidelines for each of the 4 treatments. And these are the 4 treatments: preservation, restoration, reconstruction, and rehabilitation. So in normal conversation, we interchangeably use preservation, restoration, reconstruction, and rehabilitation, right? I just bought a house, I'm preserving it, I'm restoring it, I'm rehabbing it. And that's fine for normal conversation, but technically speaking, those words relate to 4 different but overlapping ways of how to treat a historic resource. So for each of these 4 treatments, the Secretary of the Interior has created a set of standards and a set of guidelines that explains what that means. What does it mean when you're preserving a building versus restoring it, reconstructing it, or rehabbing it? Why does this matter at all? And also, this is definitely like an entire class, a semester in grad school. So why do you, average homeowner, property owner, community member, need to know about this? The reason you need to know about this is that for 99% of the regulatory processes that you're going to participate in that involve historic buildings, so that's going to be if your building is locally landmarked and you need to get a certificate of appropriateness for exterior changes, if you are pursuing historic tax credits, if you're pursuing a historic grant that from a state or nonprofit organization, those regulatory processes, 99% of them are going to use the standards and guidelines of rehabilitation to evaluate your work. Why are they using the standards of rehabilitation to evaluate your work? It's because of all of these 4 treatments. It's the standards of rehabilitation that allow for modern changes on buildings. When we talk about the treatments of preservation, restoration, and reconstruction, those 3 are all about freezing a building in a particular moment of time. Preservation is freezing it as it is, not making major changes, sustaining its existing form and integrity of materials. It was built as a city hall. We're going to keep using it as a city hall. We're not going to change out the mechanicals or any major aspects of the building. We're going to keep it the way it is. We're preserving it. Restoration is about bringing a building backwards in time to a particular moment. There's a Frank Lloyd Wright house up in Western New York that just finished a huge restoration project where they brought it back to the last moment that Frank Lloyd Wright had touched the building, right? So that meant that they had to reconstruct elements that had been removed since he had walked away from the building in the 19 teens. And there were things that needed to be removed from the building that had been added to it that were not his designs, but they were restoring it and doing what needed to be done according to documentation to bring it backwards. And that's the same with reconstruction. You're taking a building and bringing it backwards in time, but it's a building that doesn't actually exist anymore, and you're rebuilding it to be in that past moment in time. So again, it is rehabilitation, where the standards and guidelines are written to allow for continued use while preserving character-defining features. So again, any sort of regulatory process that you are going to be a part of as far as historic resources, it's going to be those standards for rehabilitation that you're going to want to take a look at and be making sure that your project is in accordance of. Here are those 10 standards of rehabilitation. Again, those 10 core principles of what it means to rehabilitate. But essentially, Cliff Notes version, it means that you're going to retain your existing historic materials, as much of that as you can. You're going to repair the historic character-defining features if they are damaged. And you're going to repair them with in-kind materials, with similar materials, right? Or if that material has reached the end of its lifehood, right? Things don't last forever. And if you have to replace a character-defining feature on that building, any of those historic materials, then you need to replace it as in-kind as possible. So if you have original wood elements that have failed and need to be replaced, then we need to replace them with wood or an in-kind replacement to wood. If you have, slate shingles on your roof, it needs to be an in-kind replacement. Sometimes there's, modern materials that have been approved as in-kind replacements. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it always has to be the same exact material it originally had. There are other materials that have been found to be as in-kind as possible. So that is the Cliff Notes on the standards of rehabilitation. All right, that is crash course of terms and processes. And I see that we do have one question already that we'll get to at the end, but please don't worry, don't hesitate, put any questions you have in the Q&A box. Next, we're going to quickly kind of go through the different designations and regulations that exist and involve historic properties. So before we get into the different types of designations, it's good to understand the types of words that we're going to encounter, right? So designation is the same as landmarking. It's a process where we are formally recognizing a resource as historic. You can landmark and designate, interchangeably using those words. Landmark, designate individual resources, so individual houses, an individual bridge, an individual monument, or you can nominate historic districts or collection, a geographic collection, grouping of resources. Okay, so when we're talking about evaluating these resources for designation, we're going to be talking about criteria, integrity, and significance during that evaluation process. Criteria, pretty straightforward definition. It's the principles and standards to evaluate properties. So each type of designation process that you're going to participate in, whether it's the federal process, a state process, or a local level process, that designation, that landmarking process is going to have a listing of these are the criteria. They're going to say what are your criteria you need to meet to be eligible. So it's going to be dependent on individual to that designation level, but they have to have a set of criteria. Integrity, again, we kind of touched on this briefly when we talked about the National Register, but integrity relates to the authenticity of a property's historic identity. So if you're saying that this building's historic identity is that it is a fine example of a Queen Anne style house, when we look at that building, we should see elements related to Queen Anne style architecture surviving on that building. The National Park Service has created a definition of the 7 aspects of integrity. We're going to get into that in a much more detail at our landmarking basics workshop next time. This time, we're just kind of doing a little bit more of an overview on it. And then lastly, significance. I think the most straightforward of the terms, it's that who, what, where, when of the history of the building. What is the role that that property played in not just an individual historic event or person, but also into the broad pattern of history? Because again, history has happened all over this place. There's lots of many layers of history associated with different resources. It's not just what is that significance, how does it interlay to the local community, and then how does it tie into broader patterns of history? Something to also keep in mind is the so-called 50-year rule. When they were creating the National Register of Historic Places, it was added into the criteria evaluation of that program that something needed to be at least 50 years old to be deemed historic, right? Why 50 years old? We're evaluating history, right? We're looking at the events and individuals and materials, all the factors of this resource and trying to evaluate what is its historic significance. Is it worthy of preservation of that significance? And to just, evaluate all of this. If this resource is younger than 50 years, we might not have had enough time, enough history to be able to evaluate whether or not it meets the criteria for designation. So that 50-year rule is more of just making sure that we have enough buffer, enough historical record to actually evaluate so that we're making, fair assessments of significance. But that is just for the National Register. It has kind of weaseled its way and melted its way into a lot of other preservation regulation, but it's not a hard, fast rule. Things that are younger than 50 years old can certainly get eligible and be designated. I'm just now realizing that my image that you see on the screen is all of the records, albums that were released in 1974. I need to update this to be our 50-year mark in 75 now, so I have to update these pictures. But just keep that in mind, that there is that aspect, at least for the National Register, that we need to be mindful of that 50-year mark. Something else to be mindful of when we're talking about designations and the subsequent regulatory processes that come out of this. And, we touched on it briefly when we were talking about the standards of rehabilitation and how the standards of rehabilitation are all about how do we keep living in these buildings? How do we keep these historic stuff that we love in our community and to help define our community and all that yummy good stuff? But we just need to keep living in them, right? So how do we make the necessary changes for modern living while preserving as much of that character defining features? So when we think about that, we need to make sure that we're, the point of this in our regulatory processes and in preserving our historic buildings is not that everyone needs to live in a historic house museum, right? Historic house museums are lovely and great, and I visit them regularly for my professional and personal life. But the goal of landmarking buildings, the goal of regulating historic resources is not to make everyone live in a fantasy Disneyland of history, right? It's about allowing that review process that we can make smart decisions with our resources based on their historic significance. So that's an important thing to keep in mind as well. All right, so the different types of designations that exist in our world, well, in America world. At the tip top, which we already talked about, is the National Historic Landmark Program, NHL program. Again, that is for the creme de la creme, those resources that are so significant that they impact our national narrative. They impact the path that we have taken as collectively as Americans. Then we have, again, at the federal level, the National Register of Historic Places. So those are resources that have significance at the local, state, or federal level that are worthy of preservation for their historic significance. We have the National Register of Historic Places, and then we have local level landmarking. We already talked about the National Historic Landmark Program, but let's just quickly talk about the National Register Program again. Repeating myself, enabled by the 1966 Preservation Act. It's our federal government's official listing of individual sites, districts, structures, and objects deemed worthy of preservation for their historic significance. Again, Europeaners have been on this continent for over 400 years. We could identify so many places as having had history associated with them. We need to make sure that we're evaluating that worthy of preservation as well. Huge mega thing to understand about the National Register of Historic Places is that it is honorary only. There is no regulatory process automatically associated with landmarking onto the listing into the National Register of Historic Places. You could get listed in the National Register of Historic Places today and tomorrow use your own money to demolish it, as long as you're following your community's rules about demolitions. As long as you follow the law about getting permits and all that jazz, you can tear that building down with no repercussion from the federal government. Where the federal government or state government might get involved is if you're asking them for money or a permit to do your project involving a National Register historic place listed in the National Register. So yeah, so if you want to use historic tax credits on your building, then your project will be reviewed by National Park Service or the Maryland Historical Trust to make sure that you're following the different preservation rules that are associated with that project. But if you're not taking their money or asking them for permits, if you're just simply listed in the National Register, you can do whatever you want with that building. As I was mentioning, while it is not a regulatory process associated with it, it is just honorary, it is a major gateway to available funding out there. Most notably, the National Historic Tax Credit Program. Maryland has a little bit different rules, and there is a little bit more funding that is available for things that are not listed on the National Register compared to other states. But the National Register listing is still a requirement for most preservation funding opportunities at the federal level, and for many nonprofit organizations, national nonprofit organizations as well. It's a great land use tool. You don't just list something on the National Register today in one day. It's something that requires a lot of research. There is a review process. There's a whole way that you prepare this documentation and prepare this nomination. So it is an incredibly invaluable land use tool. If we look at other aspects of our built environment, when we're dealing with our roads, with our waterways, we do a lot of studies before we make changes to any of those entities, right? Before we change an intersection, we put those car counter things down. They do a whole study for a couple of weeks and figure out what's the best way to change that light intersection to benefit everybody. But when it comes to our historic buildings, we're often demolishing them without second thoughts, without any sort of extra research being done or understanding of why and how those historic buildings were configured the way that they were and how that might impact future developments, right? So again, even if you don't get listed into the National Register, the work to do this National Register nomination is an invaluable land use tool. The last thing to keep in mind about the National Register is that owner approval is required. I think it's a silly, stupid rule, not going to lie, because again, there is no regulatory function associated with this. There is no infringement on your private property rights. So then ask your permission seems kind of silly, but it is an action of the federal government. They are taking a step to identify and designate your building as historic. So they need to make sure they have your approval for that. How that works is if it's about an individual site, it's a one building that's getting listed, that individual property owner or collection of owners need to say yes. If it's a historic district that has lots of property owners involved, then just the overwhelming response, the response received from those property owners needs to be overwhelmingly positive to have that historic district get approved. So for the National Register of Historic Places, there are 4 different main criteria. So you have to meet one or more of these to be deemed eligible. Excuse me. There's criteria A, which is about being associated with an event or a broad pattern of history. Criteria B is it having to do with a certain person or group of people, clubs, whatever's. Criteria C is all about craftsmanship and materials and architecture, engineering, the actual resource itself, what makes that special. And then criteria D is that it has or would likely yield important information about prehistory. So this is archaeology, whether it has been physically discovered or it is potentially discovered, all things prehistory archaeology. Again, you have to meet one or more of these to be eligible for the National Register. Onward to the state level, there is a Maryland Register of Historic Places. It was enabled by the Maryland General Assembly in 1985. But like many states in this country, the process for getting listed into the state register has just basically been incorporated into the process of getting listed into the National Register of Historic Places. So when you talk to the Maryland Historical Trust and you start that process and you submit that nomination, they're going to first evaluate it for its inclusion on the state register. And then once it gets over that bump, the documentation will get passed on to the National Park Service for review and consideration for the National Register of Historic Places. So there's not necessarily a separate form or process. It's just kind of all incorporated into it. So we don't really talk about the Maryland Register of Historic Places too much. But all of those things that I said about the National Register, about being honorary only, gateway to money, land use tool, owner approval, and not owner approval, but all of that has same implications for the Maryland Register. What you hear about more often, though, about state level preservation is the Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties, the MIHP. You hear about that. MIHP is a repository of information on resources of known or potential value to prehistory and history of the state of Maryland. It is an inventory. It is a collection of inventory forms and other types of documentation. It is not a designation level. These resources that are included in the MIHP have not been stamped and like, yes, we are landmarking them. These are just the inventory forms, right? So it's more than 13,000 archaeological sites. The number says 43,000 historic and architectural resources. I have to believe that that's more by now. So this gets a little kind of complicated because it's not a regulatory process. It's not necessarily a designation. It hasn't been created that way. But at the same time, being listed in the MIHP, having a MIHP form that has been then updated as being deemed eligible, that is an eligibility requirement for certain funding and other processes. So on one hand, this isn't mean that you're designated in any way just because you're in the MIHP, but for certain funding opportunities and other programs, your resource needs to be in the MIHP to be eligible. So it gets a little confusing sometimes. When you go into Medusa and you put your address in and you try to find your MIHP form or other documentation that exists, this is what it may look like. The forms have been updated over the years. Maryland would make their own forms. Sometimes we would just use the National Register form. So everyone is going to look a little bit different. Here is an example that I found in Talbot County. So this is Martinham. It's originally the core block of that black and white picture that was included in its inventory form from 1977. They were saying that it was dating from the early 1700s. So crazy old little wood framed house out here, has some outbuildings, but then you can see on the right-hand side that first page of its inventory form. It had a little bit of information about the architecture and some guesstimations on its history. So this is what one MIHP form might include. Almost all of them will have that cover sheet where it says the name of the resource and explains what the file is that you're looking at, the inventory forms, and then almost always will have a black and white high definition, kind of big, large format photograph like this. Okay, local level landmarking. There are several sections of the Maryland State Code that relate to historic preservation regulation and zoning. 66B, 25A, 28 are the ones that apply to the majority of the state. There's also additional sections of the code that relate specifically to like Baltimore City and Montgomery and PG counties, because they each have their own kind of different things happening. But there is several places in the state code that enable and make it possible and set it as a matter of public policy that allow local municipalities and counties to enact their own preservation ordinances. It's important to understand when we're talking about local level landmarking, your preservation ordinances, that it is just another type of zoning overlay, right? It's not an aesthetic kind of choicing. It's another type of zoning. So when we talk about kind of conventional zoning, we're regulating parcels based on their property use and the type of structure they are, right? Whereas with historic preservation zoning, preservation ordinances, we're regulating a particular parcel based on its eligibility and meeting of the criteria and its historic significance. And so for each of those, they have sets of guidelines and standards that help evaluate what does it mean to be this type of zoning use, and then the same thing for historic preservation. So it is just a different type of zoning. In Talbot County, you have a county level preservation ordinance. It was enacted in 1976. It's one of the earlier counties in the state to have a preservation ordinance. In celebration of the bicentennial in 1976, there was a lot of preservation activity, so a lot of communities joined up at that time. So at the county level, the Preservation Commission that's enacted by that ordinance is then there to regulate the landmarked buildings, the county level landmarked buildings, and then have a whole bunch of other types of powers and duties that are outlined by that law. There are also 2 municipalities in Talbot County that also have their own landmark preservation ordinances on the books. Easton and Oxford both have preservation ordinances. All 3 of them have a little slight differences into how they're written, but essentially, again, it's about enabling the designation of local landmarks, whether the county or at these 2 city levels, and then that framework for how they can regulate those properties. Regulating those properties means approving those certificates of appropriateness requests for exterior changes. Those requests that will be based on standards of rehabilitation or specially made design guidelines that are influenced and directed by those standards of rehabilitation. The last thing I want to mention as it relates to kind of local level landmarking, or I think the last thing, is the idea of the Certified Local Government Program. So this is a program of the federal government. It was created in 1980 from another expansion and updating of the National Historic Preservation Act. So it's created and funded by the federal government, but it is run by our SHPOs, by Maryland Historical Trust for us. The whole point of the CLG program is basically like a gold star for municipalities that are doing preservation up to best practices and standards and guidelines. So there is an eligibility form or criteria list, and you have to check off all of those eligibility requirements to be deemed designated a certified local government. All of those kind of criterias and eligibility requirements all relate to, again, following standards and guidelines, meaning that they have a designated staff person that works on preservation. They have a commission that has members elected or selected from the community with term limits, that they keep their documents, that they have regular meetings, a whole slew of very kind of achievable, normal, good government activities as it relates to preservation. And once you become designated as a CLG, it kind of opens the door to extra assistance that you can get. Talbot County has successfully become a certified local government, along with all those other cities and counties in the state. When you become a CLG, you get a little bit more extra time from our wonderful staff at MHT to answer questions and provide trainings. And then it also opens the door to the Historic Preservation Fund, the CLG grant program, which is a special pot of money that is only available to CLGs. So that is the best reason why all municipalities that have preservation ordinances should be aspiring to secure local government status, CLG status. And again, Talbot County, great job on securing that. And our last topic that we're gonna run through is the benefits of historic preservation. Again, kind of touch on the broad strokes of how preservation impacts our communities. Everything that we've talked about tonight could definitely be, semesters, year-long classes in a preservation grad school program. So we're not going to touch on every single benefit of preservation, but just want to get the ball going on understanding on how all of this helps us. As we mentioned in the beginning, preservation is the most sustainable way to deal with our historic built environment. We talk a lot about the culture and historic side of keeping these connections to the past. That is definitely understandable. But again, from the environmental and financial point of view, it is the most sustainable way to deal with these resources. We're going to talk about that. They kind of interlock and overlap. So there's not kind of clean arguments either way. So we'll talk about a bunch of different things right now. First and foremost, kind of the most basic benefit to historic preservation is that eligibility marker that now, because you're landmarked, you can access different tax credits and other financial incentives. So again, historic tax credits for property owners, so for homeowners or for income producing commercial properties. A lot of people like to talk about these as, there's state credits, there's federal credits. That can kind of get confusing because, again, not every tax credit is eligible to every property owner. So again, I think it's a lot easier to talk about it as a homeowner credit or a commercial income producing credit. So for homeowners, there's only a statewide credit. There's a 20% Maryland state tax credit for historic properties that is run through the Maryland Historical Trust. They have a great site on their website, a landing page, and a brochure that walks you through step by step the process, not just understanding how the tax credit program works and how the 20% is applied and all that jazz, but it literally walks you through the application process, the form itself, and how to fill that out. So really great help from them on that. And then in the pink shaded boxes are all those commercial tax credits that exist. On the state level, there are two different tax credits for commercial projects, the competitive tax credit and then the small commercial. So each of those will provide 20%. You can't use both of them. You have to choose which one you're going to pursue based on your project. Larger projects are going to go for that competitive grant. Smaller projects, under, I forget the title number right off the top of my head right now, but smaller projects, quicker projects, you're going to go for that commercial one. So you choose from one of those, and then you can match that, you can pair that with the 20% federal commercial tax credit. So for eligible, making sure that you're reaching all the different eligibility requirements for all the different programs, commercial income producing properties have the possibility of securing a combined 40% tax credits on their historic projects. Historic tax credits, there's lots of local municipalities that have created tax credits. And so here's a couple of the seals of the communities that have those: Baltimore County, Baltimore City, Hartford, Montgomery County, Frederick, Prince George's. Again, there's several others that also have tax credits, either tax credits where you get a credit for a portion of the money you spent on your house, or tax credit in an abatement on the increased value of your house now that you've done that improvement project. Unfortunately for Talbot County, there is not a local level historic tax credit, but if you were to buy property in a different county or a different municipality, that might be an option for you. So something to keep in mind, even though it's sadly not an option available in Talbot County currently. There are also grant monies and other funding incentives that exist. Maryland Historical Trust operates a really great listing of kind of the preservation usual suspects. They recently updated it on their website to be a kind of a sortable spreadsheet, so that'll help you kind of navigate through that list. It used to be a handy little flyer paper, so that's what you see on the left-hand side there. And then also super important to mention that we at Preservation Maryland have our own grant program called Heritage Fund. We just opened applications on Monday, so we just opened it up for the fiscal year 25 funding cycle. In our Heritage Fund program, you can ask up to $10,000 for a wide range of historic preservation programs. So head over to our website and you can get more information on that. For more benefits and beneficial impacts of historic preservation on communities, here's just a handful of the covers of some of the reports that have been done in Maryland, either on a local level or state level, analyzing different aspects of preservation. Some of them are looking at the financial impact of historic tax credits, looking at heritage tourism, all the different kind of facets of preservation. And I have to say, in my 20-something years of doing this now and all the different reports that I've looked at, I couldn't honestly tell you one report that had some sort of negative impact on a community for historic preservation. Obviously, when we're talking about historic tax credits and those types of funding incentives, the reports show, again, no matter what community you're in, urban, suburban, rural, that you see a much, not just a bigger impact when it comes to historic monies, but a longer lasting impact in that community. And then especially as it relates to local level landmarking, something that's always been interesting to me, that often happens, usually happens in studies of local landmarking, is this idea of it stabilizing tax assessment values. That by applying that local level landmarking to an area through a historic district, that because you will have that extra level, that extra step of regulation, it does a lot about scaring off potential property owners, scaring off, not totally, but kind of disincentivizing property owners who might want to make changes to the building based on market whims and not necessarily the desires and needs of the community itself. So where you have a community that's not landmarked and don't have the standards of rehabilitation to help dictate and protect historic character defining features, you can have a lot of market-driven ebbs and flows in development, which then would impact tax values as well. Whereas with communities that have local landmarking, because you're kind of eliminating those highs and lows of following the market trends, you're allowing a community the space to breathe and slowly grow and improve on their timetable and not the markets. So again, lots of studies out there. We have some of them linked on our websites. On our website, there's a firm called Place Economics. That is one of the firms that creates a lot of these reports. They have a lot of them on their website as well. And then quickly, just two or three different reports that kind of look specifically on different aspects of preservation, financially and environmentally speaking. And so here is one from the National Park Service, from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, from their Preservation Green Lab project, where they looked at quantifying the environmental value of building reuse. So they looked at the economic environmental impact of rehabbing a building compared to building a brand new energy efficient building. They looked at it a bunch of different ways. It's a really interesting report. Highly recommend looking it up. But here you can kind of see in this slightly pixelated screenshot, understanding how many years that even if you were to build a new building as energy efficient as possible, how many years it would still take to kind of make up for the embodied energy lost and energy used to create that brand new historic building, that brand new building. So, you have here where it's Chicago and Portland, a single family residence. Again, no matter how energy efficient you're making that new single family residence, it's going to take 38 years to make up for all of that energy lost, compared to if that single family residence had been rehabbed and that evaluation there. So again, really fascinating report to take a look at. Here's another one from Preservation Green Lab that looks specifically at windows, original wood windows, and evaluating energy efficiency through that. This chart I love, but also hate because it's a little complicated to read. But you'll see the teal kind of color that is the highest on all of these different locales. And that relates to the new high performance replacement windows. So yes, the study does say that a new high performance replacement window is going to outperform your old historic window. Sure, we recognize that. But when you take your historic old window, you fix it, make it functional and operating correctly, and then match that with things like weather stripping, interior or exterior storms, and other kind of retrofitting tasks, that those combined efforts actually end up outperforming significantly your brand new high performance replacement window. And it talks about a couple other factors into this report. But again, really interesting numbers looking at that. And again, looking at it from different areas of the country. So no matter which kind of climate we're talking about, the data kind of supports that no matter where, rehabbing and weather stripping and improving the existing wood window is going to be better environmentally and economically than if you just replace a new one. The last thing I'll say when it comes specifically to windows is that understanding that windows, when you have a material that's being sold to you as having a lifetime guarantee, that means it can't be fixed. That's what that means. It doesn't mean that it's going to last forever. It means that the one you have is going to last until it doesn't last anymore. And so my fun example that I explain when it comes to windows is that my parents, knowing very well what I do for a living, waited till I moved out of state to replace all the windows in their 1940s little cottage. And so I came home to visit one time, realizing that I did not have keys to their house until I was already quite late and out too late. So I came home, had a couple of drinks in me, and needed to open one of these brand new replacement windows that they had just put into the house. And I kind of just shimmied the window up and tucked and rolled inside and went to bed. Come to find out the next day that I had shattered the entire locking mechanism of that replacement window. And because it's, lifetime guarantee until it's broken, they had to, it's not, individual parts that could be fixed. They had to replace the whole entire window unit. So it was $400 or $500, brand new window they had to replace because my little winky dink arms broke the entire locking mechanism. That had been an original wood window. We either would have just not have had it locked because we would have forgotten and I could have just opened it, or I could have just broken the glass and then next day, $20, got the glass fixed. But in this case, it was $400. So that's a fun story. With that, that is the very quick crash course in preservation basics. Thank you so very much for going on this journey with me. There is a question in the Q&A I would gladly answer now, and I really hope that other people put more questions in. The question here is, what local preservation groups are there in Talbot County? So Talbot County, you have the Talbot Historical Society is certainly a partner in preserving and celebrating our historic built environment and culture. There are a few other kind of community organizations and development groups that maybe not necessarily call themselves preservation or use preservation in their title, but are still working to preserve and support a sense of place. I think that's really important to understand, is that it's not just people in groups with preservation in their title that are doing preservation. So those are the groups that I'm aware of. I'm certainly trying to collect and get to know more organizations doing preservation across the state. As your program and outreach manager, I want to make sure that not just that we know about each other, but that I can be here to provide you with the assistance and support that you need. Again, like I said at the start, we can't be everywhere and we can't be protecting and preserving every resource. So making sure that you have access to us, that we can get you the information. If you call me with a question, if I can't get you the answer, I can't get you the money, then let's go figure out who we need to talk to get you that answer and get you that money. We just had another question come in, which is, are there any lists of vetted construction professionals who can do repairs on historic buildings and homes? So yes, so we do maintain a list here at Preservation Maryland. It's called Preserve List. If you Google it, there used to be a page on our website dedicated to it where you could navigate and pull the names on your own. We're having just some technical issues and just kind of revamping the website. So when you find it on the internet, it's not going to work, but you can call me, Christiana Limniadis, and I can provide you some recommendations for contractors and other preservation related consultants. I wouldn't necessarily, vetted is a strong language. We're not necessarily going and double checking all of these groups or doing interviews or anything like that, but everyone on our list are contractors or consultants who have either worked on projects that are funded through the Heritage Fund grant program or have been funded through our sister and partner organizations. So these are going to be contractors and consultants who have a proven track record working on preservation projects, and especially those preservation projects that we know that are getting certain types of scrutiny and regulation. Great question. Next question, in a historic district, when does a non-contributing structure become contributing structure? That is a fascinating question and a lot more complicated than a quick answer for right now. But my attempt at a quick answer for you is that it's wholly dependent on the significance and integrity of that resource, right? So there are examples of, okay, just to take a step back, sorry for those joining us today that might not know what this means. So we have a historic district. When we have a historic district, it is a geographical area, right? It's your neighborhood. It's the line boundary drawn around the geographic area, and all of the resources within that boundary are in the historic district. And then each of those resources are evaluated as either contributing in that its individual story contributes to the overall history of the historic district, or that individual resource does not contribute. A really great simple example would be you have, a historic district that is the downtown of your historic community. It's your main street and your high street intersection, maybe some of the neighborhood and residential areas going on either side of that main street area. And then you have and it's all, Victorian era architecture. And then you have that 1970s McDonald's that was built right in the middle of it, right? That 70s McDonald's is still within the historic district. So it's listed in the National Register. It's listed as a local landmark, but it's non-contributing because that 1970s architecture and planning and style and design and individual significance does not contribute to the overall. But once that 1970s McDonald's becomes 50 years old or older, we can kind of reevaluate its significance. Is it contributing now that it's reached that age? We can reevaluate that. So that's kind of one example where it's that outlier of architecture is an example. And then there's other examples where resources have been deemed as non-contributing because they had some integrity issues. So you might have a street that is all, pre-Civil War cottages. And a lot of them have high integrity. They have the original wood siding, the original windows, but some of them might have had a lot of changes to them and visually have replacement siding on the outside, have different types of windows, have had changes to their roof form, things like that. But since that historic district has been created, they might have had different owners that had different value system, and they've gone back and restored that building and removed those modern materials and put on either repaired and restored the original or did a replacement in kind. So now they've kind of changed that building. So then you can then go back and reevaluate now that it has, new materials on it to say, is this still non-contributing or have they improved this condition? And it can be a contributing structure. So that is a very long, complicated answer to say that it is very specific to that individual building and individual story, but it 100% can happen. It can be reevaluated, and you can have resources that go from being non-contributing to now being evaluated as contributing, and vice versa. If a building has been destroyed in some way or altered in some way that is very extreme and not in accordance with the preservation guidelines, you can have a building be landmarked as well. That was a very great question. Any other questions? Again, I thank you all so very much for joining us tonight. We have been recording, so we'll be making that available. Everyone who signed up for tonight's workshop will get a follow-up email in a couple of days with a link to the presentation, and a couple other things that I mentioned this evening, and then the recording as well. Like I said at the beginning, this is our first in a series of 3 lectures, so please, I hope that you'll join us in February for the landmarking basics, and then hopefully see all of your faces in person at the Talbot Historical Society in March for our Researching Your Historic Places workshop. With that, thank you so very much and have a great rest of your evening. Good night.